A house divided against itself cannot stand. No truer were those words than the Roman Empire in the year 270. For the past century, the Eternal City was drained from constant warfare, laid waste by disaster, and plundered of its treasures by enemies both near and far. It is said that no empire lasts forever, but it's also true that no empire was ever truly beaten by its external enemies. For the past 100 years, generals and corrupt senators were fighting not for their nation, but for their ambition. Constant plots and treachery, emperor after emperor proclaimed, overthrown, and assassinated. From this unending battle, two generals would distinguish themselves above the rest. Tetricus, securing the lands of Gaul and Hispania, declared his independence from the emperor in Rome, and in Syria, Odenathus secured his fiefdom centered around the thriving city of Palmyra. To curb his growing power, the emperor gave the order to have this general assassinated and Palmyra brought back into the fold. But the successful plot ended with a spectacular blunder, as its conspirators were brought to light, and so outraged were the people for their beloved leader, they chose to rally around the general's widow, Queen Zenobia, and their infant son. But the Romans could only watch these troubling developments, paralyzed by the barbarians infiltrating their porous border. And the man facing their hordes was Emperor Claudius, a brilliant battlefield commander who beat back the barbarian hordes, using this reprieve to retake Spain's silver mines from the usurper. Surely history would remember him as the man who saved Rome, but it wasn't meant to be. From the breakdown of trade and communication, so too did the knowledge of medicines and hygiene disintegrate, as an enemy more terrifying than any army ravaged the Balkans, one that didn't distinguish child from man or emperor from peasant. With the death of another emperor came another succession crisis. The corrupt members of the Senate named General Quintilius as Augustus, a weak man who would turn a blind eye as they continued to pilfer the state treasury. But as was common in this century, the field army was loyal to their own Kaiser, the right-hand man of Claudius, an Illyrian peasant who rose through the ranks as an esteemed cavalry general, Emperor Aurelian. After negotiations from both parties predictably failed, Aurelian moved his forces to challenge Quintilius, who was too occupied by the lavish life his title bestowed upon him to prepare any meaningful response. It was obvious which man was fit to be emperor. As Quintilius's legions defected, the Senate had no choice but to recognize Aurelian as the rightful emperor of the doomed empire. This succession crisis left no legions available to stop the Germanics, Goths, and Vandals from simultaneously crossing the border and ravaging the countryside, leaving neither the food nor funds to bolster the army. An army that was still divided, as legions in Illyria proclaimed Septimus as their new emperor. In this weakened state, Tetricus used this opportunity to lay out his army ready to retake Spain. Zenobia, in turn, utilized her late husband's fame to take control of critical Egyptian grain and 2 of the empire's 5 mints. The Roman Empire was never supposed to fall in the 5th century. The 3rd was going to be its grave. Nonetheless, Aurelian steeled himself for the difficult road ahead. The most immediate danger was neither Zenobia's monopoly nor Gaul's mobilization. These would prove minor distractions if the Germans sacked what was left of the empire. So in the year 270, the new emperor aced his first test when he pushed back the Germanic invasion of the Italian boot. But the victory was far from decisive. and he couldn't afford to chase them down when the Vandals began to plunder Pannonia. This was the decisive moment. For the past century, the Empire was playing whack-a-mole with its many enemies. If the crisis were ever to come to an end, there needed to be multiple decisive plays to push back the invaders and strengthen the ailing army. And Aurelian had just the move. So dire was the situation that for the first time an emperor was crowned outside Rome in the city of Siscia. After a limited ceremony, Aurelian ordered every grain of wheat, livestock, and anything valuable to be evacuated from the front lines. This scorched earth policy proved effective, as the barbarians would never go back empty-handed, and the further they pushed in, the hungrier they became. Finally, with their fighting spirit and numbers reduced, Aurelian pounced, crushing the Vandals decisively, forcing them all the way back to the river. With their backs pinned and stockpiles run dry, the second part of the Emperor's plan was enacted. In exchange for safe passage back home and desperately needed supplies for the trip, the Vandals would return all the loot they'd stolen, as well as provide a cavalry contingent for the army. With the barbarians pushed back and the army bolstered, it seemed like the incursions were finally defeated for good. But Aurelian's previous mistake had come back to haunt him, and with his forces moving west, an old enemy was about to make his move. Never before had there been an army like this one. With such overwhelming numbers, the Germanics were rolling through the north like a pack of locusts, razing everything in their path. But numbers alone would not make them the threat they were. They'd rallied around competent leadership. On his way to meet them in battle, Aurelian was ambushed, suffering heavy losses. The army, already straining, was at its breaking point, crushed so thoroughly that under most leaders this would prove their end. But unlike before, there was no other army that could pick up where another failed. No one was left to stop the Germans from reaching the Eternal City. But in their greed for gold and loot, the Germans forgot that Aurelian was no mere emperor. He quickly rallied what was left of his army and force-marched his troops down the peninsula to ambush the barbarians in the Battle of Phano, sending them into a hasty retreat back north to the safety of Germania. But the Romans had learned from their previous mistake and kept on their heels, crushing them in battle after battle before finally vanquishing their foe once and for all in Ticinum. A victory so complete that no Germanic army would threaten Rome for the next 150 years. But the slow travel of news at the time meant that the citizens of Rome were still oblivious to this victory. In fact, the city believing that the emperor had fallen was in open revolt. This wouldn't do, and Aurelian himself had moved into the city for the first time in his emperorship to restore order. Thankfully, his prestige from the recent victory, as well as his admirable orating skills.
We're gonna win so much, you may even get tired of winning, and you'll say, please, please, it's too much winning. We can't take it anymore.
Gave him the support he needed to oust his political opponents, corrupt political opponents, and seize their assets. You see, Aurelian despised corruption more than anybody else in the empire, and so he didn't feel bad at all when he used those seized assets to raise new forces that were sent to defend against the Gallic incursions, which were pushed back. And while the invading army was nothing more than a raiding party, this win still proved to the usurper that Rome still stood, and that instead of risking it all on black, he needed to wait for his opportunity to strike. This bought precious time for Aurelian to deal with his rival emperor, one who was extremely unpopular by both civilians and increasingly his own soldiers. This fact led to Aurelian ordering the assassination of Septimus, which not only secured his throne, but also brought the Illyrian legions back into the fold. For the first time since the death of Claudius, Rome was now a stable realm. But stability could turn to chaos at any point. And to prevent another risk of invasion and its ensuing rebellion, big, beautiful walls were constructed to protect the capital. And I'd imagine Germania paid for it all. Unfortunately, Aurelian would only be around for the initial phases of this construction, as King Cannabis, the man who had obliterated Rome 20 years prior, had made his return, at the head of an army double the size, looking for double the plunder. This behemoth of an army would pose the greatest threat to Aurelian up to this point. The only advantage the Romans had was King Grass's arrogance. After destroying a Roman emperor and living off their plunder for the last 20 years in a battle so decisive it spiraled the 3rd century crisis into its own sub-crisis, he believed the empire to be a spent force, and so focused his time on gathering as much plunder as he could carry. But what showed up to face him wasn't a ragtag group of militia King Marijuana had come to expect, but a well-disciplined elite army organized under one of the greatest generals of the time. And it came as no surprise when the cocky general was depantsed and deflowered in record speed. Not only did Aurelian make this once feared commander look like Scotty Barnes, he did what no Roman emperor had done this century, by counter-invading the Gothic homeland and giving them the Carthage Special, Kobeing his way through their territory, killing the king in the process, before laying waste to all his settlements. But there was one thing this decisive victory made clear to everyone at the time. The Balkan frontier was indefensible. For too long it had been the most hemorrhagic of all of Rome's borders, and changes needed to be made. And so, with great sorrow, Aurelian did what no emperor before him had even dreamed of. He gave up Roman land. While losing Danubia was a blow to Roman pride, it was a practical decision, allowing for a far more defensible Danubian river with more troops to man it. The citizens of Danubia were likewise evacuated to resettle the ravaged Balkans, repopulating and re-strengthening the desolate lands. With the Balkan situation now permanently dealt with, more forces were available for the upcoming fight against Rome's Achilles heel. The entire empire was reliant on grain shipments from Egypt, an Egypt now under the control of Zenobia. During this time, she also made attempts at securing Asia Minor, which would significantly deter Aurelian's abilities to land. But Zenobia would rather her forces to protect her core Syrian territory, and so her efforts had stalled. Before she could reinforce, Aurelian would now embark on the campaign, whose grain prize would spell the fate of the empire. Seeing as how he was about to blow her shit smooth off, Zenobia promptly proclaimed her son Augustus, and herself Augusta, cutting off all grain shipments to Rome and declaring her independence. With both the rich Asia Minor as well as Egypt under her control, Zenobia not only controlled the food, but also the money. Alexandria and Antioch were home to two of the empire's mints, allowing her to print enough money to fund her Palmyran empire. This gave Aurelian a poison pill option. Does he send his forces through Anatolia or focus on securing Egypt? He decided to put it all on black. Half his army would march through the weakly defended Anatolia, while the other half would attempt a risky naval maneuver to capture the all-important Alexandria. If they failed to land, or stalled just long enough for Zenobia to react, then his campaign and Rome itself were doomed. Being a naval landing, there were immense struggles at first, fighting up the beaches and then up to one of the largest cities of the time with limited foraging and no supply lines. The Egyptian campaign faced defeat dead in the eye, with even the general sent to lead the campaign himself nearly being captured. But Aurelian had chosen his general well, and Probus proved himself just as capable as the emperor when he secured Rome's lifeline. The main army in Anatolia could now breathe easy, with just one simple goal in mind: to take back Asia Minor. In their march to the Taurus Mountains, the Romans faced a new enemy standing in their way: Zenobia's Clibinari. While isolated, this elite cataphract proved its mettle in battle, nearly destroying a Roman force 3 times its size. It was only the fact that Palmyra's forces were stretched thin that eventually allowed the Romans to overwhelm this behemoth through overwhelming numbers. But this wasn't the end, as Zenobia had thousands more ready to be deployed once the Romans entered Syria. But to get there, they would have to retake the cities standing in their way. But this is where the naval invasion of Egypt really paid off. In her haste to defend her heartland and Egypt, these newly conquered Anatolian cities were under-garrisoned and still loyal to Rome, easily falling once they saw Aurelian's banner fluttering outside their walls. All aside from the most important city, Tyana held the pass into Palmyra proper, and unlike the preceding settlements, this one was steadfast in its support for Zenobia, a city that stood for so long that Aurelian himself promised that not a single dog would be left alive by the time he was finished with these traitors. And his army promised all the plunder they could carry, greedily kept up the pressure until the city could finally take no more and was forced to surrender their fate to Aurelian's hands. But there was a problem. Tyana wasn't the last of Zenobia's fortresses. If the Romans continued besieging and suffering heavy casualties, they would be falling into the exact same trap that the Vandals did all those years ago. And while Zenobia was painted as an outsider, this was more of a civil war, and those settlements standing in their way aren't exactly going to take the Romans' plundering of a surrendered city to mean that they too should give up the fight. And so Aurelian ordered the citizens of Tyana to be spared from the victor's justice, much to the chagrin of his enraged soldiers. These soldiers reminded Aurelian of his previous promise, and the emperor was like, "You know what, you're right. I did say no dog would be left alive, so go kill all the dogs." Now, while this line isn't much of a knee slapper today, back then it was funny enough to where his soldiers acquiesced and went about carrying out the emperor's orders. This move showed exactly the difference between Aurelian and every other leader at the time. By keeping both the loyalty of his troops and the gratitude of his subjects, every other city throughout the subcontinent soon surrendered without much of a fight. And with Probus's successful campaign in Egypt, the Romans would now crash their 2 pincers into Palmyra itself. And standing in their way was the full might of the Palmyran army. This next battle would decide the war. With Alexandria fallen, the last mint still under Zenobia's control was Antioch. No doubt the bulk of her army, including her famed Clibinari, would make their final stand here. Throughout history, the outcome of a battle was solely decided on which side possessed the best cavalry, whether it be Alexander's companions, Gengish's Keshegs, or Germany's tanks. Superiority in mobility would almost always win the day, and in this field, the Romans were outgunned, but not outclassed. In this era, the greatest cavalry general of the time was Aurelian. By feigning retreat with his lightly armored horsemen in the middle of the day, the cataphracts were baited into chasing them off the battlefield. But as they chased their retreating foe further and further into the scorching Syrian desert, the heavily armored riders were utterly exhausted, which is when the Romans turned to face the Clibinari, who were too exhausted to fight and too heavy to retreat. What happened next was the most decisive victory in human history. Of the 5,000 or so cataphracts that took to the field that day, less than 100 made it to noon. During this decisive victory, Zenobia herself had entered Antioch with the royal treasury in tow, meant to bolster morale to her soldiers and citizens. And so you can imagine her shock when her generals arrived to inform her that the soldiers wouldn't be needing that bonus anytime soon. Now this was a tricky situation. They didn't want to get encircled in Antioch, but at the same time, if they visibly retreated from the city, the panic amongst the crowd would pose a danger for her and her entourage. And so she came up with a brilliant ploy. They lied and found someone who kind of looked like Aurelian to pose as the emperor they had captured in battle. And while the city was up all night celebrating their legendary empress's victory over the tyrant Aurelian, the army quietly slipped out in the middle of the night. In fact, it must have been quite a sight when they woke up the next day, only to find the armies of Aurelian still very much intact outside their walls. And so the citizens of Antioch opened the gates and celebrated the majestic Aurelian's decisive victory against the evil usurper Zenobia. And once again, clemency was given to the traitors, which convinced the very last holdouts up to Palmyra itself to surrender without a fight. But the war wasn't won yet. Zenobia retreated with the remnants of her army to Palmyra, which would soon be put under siege by Aurelian's troops. With one hope left, the queen snuck out in the middle of the night to plead her case to the Persians, hoping they would save her crumbling empire. But as she was crossing the Euphrates, the Roman scouts caught up to her. With their empress in chains and no hope in sight, Palmyra surrendered when Aurelian promised not to burn the rebellious city to the ground, a promise he kept. But the real prize was bringing her back to display in the Roman triumph that would follow his great victory. Before that triumph, he still had one last enemy to face. With the East stable, Aurelian made his way to Gaul before something horrific happened. The Palmyran elites, the same ones he pardoned, decided it would be a great idea to rebel and re-establish their empire once again. Aurelian was back so fast the city hadn't even started to prepare a defense, and this time they were given the cannabis special. Shockingly enough, the merchants of Alexandria had just heard about the uprising and thought, whatever you can do, I can do better. Aurelian got there so fast that the citizens didn't even know they were being given the Palmyra special. And finally, this time for real, it was over. Peace in the East had been established, and all that was left was the final campaign against King Tetricus, who was shaking. Tetricus asked for surrender, and Aurelian agreed, but he needed him to do something for him first. And so both armies met up in the open plains of Catalaunium, a location perfect for cavalry warfare, against the greatest cavalry general of the time, who was bolstered by his new Palmyran cataphracts. In my headcanon, the soldiers figured out this was a setup before Tetricus made a break for it and bent the knee to Aurelian and probably sucked him dry to cap off his humiliation ritual. The soldiers didn't surrender, seeing as how they were the Empire's very best, who'd held back the Germans for decades, but they were still crushed in 10 seconds flat. The crisis was finally over. The Empire was restored once again. Aurelian returned to Rome and celebrated his long-awaited triumph with Tetricus. His sons and Zenobia all paraded in front of the Sun Emperor. For his loyalty, Tetricus was made governor of a small South Italian province. Zenobia, in contrast, was Magda. She was wed to a Roman senator and allowed to live in an estate right outside the city. Her own kids eventually became senators. You know how humiliating it must be for your own kids to support the establishment of the Ops. But Aurelian wasn't just in Rome to humiliate the vanquished. He restructured the empire's finances and defenses while viciously rooting out the corruption he so hated. This task might have been more monumental than his conquests, as it took him a few years before he set his sight on the Persians. Aurelian left through the gates of his newly built walls to the cheering of a grateful crowd, but this would be the last time he would ever lay eyes on the city of Rome again. A corrupt official cooked the books and was under investigation. To save his skin, he implicated multiple high-ranking officers who eventually got tired of winning. In just 5 years, Aurelian had given Rome a new lease of life that lasted for hundreds more. And while the crisis would carry on for another decade, Rome's enemies were too spent to take advantage, giving enough time for a man named Diocletian to put an end to Rome's troubles once and for all.